Hi, 8th graders. This is Miss Ormsby, and we are continuing to talk about Civil War. As the war is beginning, we wanted to pause and ask the question, who has the advantage? So if you remember, some of the southern states have seceded, and they decided that they want to be a separate country. They're frustrated with Lincoln and with the North because they believe that the North wants to abolish slavery. All right, we've been talking about the differences between the North and the South since the beginning of the year when we were talking about the very first settlements. So I even brought up our map from earlier this year so that you can see when we're talking geography, everything was different. So in the north, they had rocky soil, they had cold winters. It was not great for growing crops. They mostly traded for things, and eventually the north would become more of an industrial center where there's lots of cities. And then in the south, there was rich soil, and it was perfect for growing crops. So they were able to have these really big farms and plantations, and ultimately they needed people to work these fields, and they fulfilled that need using slavery. We're going to kind of break it up into a few different topics. So besides geography, which we've been talking about since the beginning, we're going to look at a few other factors that there were some pretty big differences. With the question in mind of who had the advantage going into the Civil War. Okay, so let's first look at population. In the North, they had nearly 21 million people, and they'd formed mostly into cities, so they were more tightly packed. They lived closer together, which meant that they had a higher population. Of those 21 million, about 3.8 million were men of military age and were available for the war effort. In the South, the population is much smaller. They had large farms that they lived on, and they had nearly 5.5 million free people. They had millions and millions of slaves on top of that, but they didn't count them as part of their population because they referred to them as property at this point. So and the slaves were definitely not going to fight on the South's behalf. So when we're talking about who was available to fight, it really was about 1.1 million free men of military age in the South. So knowing that the South had a much smaller number of young men to draw on for fighting forces, what consequences did this situation have for the South and for the Confederate Army? I want you to go ahead and pause right here, write a few things down on your scratch paper. Alrighty, so I'm gonna have to keep moving this video, so hopefully that works out. The advantage there is definitely to the north. So you can look on this map and see this is 1860, right before the Civil War, just how different the population was in the South and the North. And due to those differences, there was a greater percentage of men in the South had to join the army, the Confederate Army, and there were more soldiers in general in the North, and because most of the male population in the South were fighting the war, that left a lot of women with the burden of farming and other tasks at home. So the advantage there, when we're talking population, definitely went to the North. Let's look at another factor. Let's talk about industry. So in the North, they had the majority of the factories in the United States. This means they had the ability to manufacture things like iron and steel. In the South, they had mainly farmland. So they did have a few factories in Virginia and some other states, but they really, really protected those factories because they were super important to the war effort. But the North had a greater ability to manufacture than the South. What are some specific things that were manufactured, do you think, that were super important to the war effort? Go ahead and stop here, pause, and write down some answers. Okie dokie. So again, the advantage here when we're talking about industry is in the North. So the North had the ability to manufacture the weapons and equipment that they needed. This includes things like rifles, cannons, railroad tracks, locomotives, and other materials. The South actually had to sell cotton to get money to buy those weapons and other war materials. So the North had the advantage when it comes to supplies for the war. Let's look at railroad and other inventions. The North had many more railroad lines than the South. They also had many more updated bridges and communication systems, specifically telegraphs that went along a lot of those railroad lines. And then in the South, they had just a few railroads, and they were mainly used for transporting cotton for export. And they did not have as many telegraph communications throughout the area. How do you think those things would have given an advantage to the North? Go ahead and pause here. Write down what you think. All right, so this was an advantage to the North, which I already said, and this was because they had the ability to transport supplies and troops much more quickly and much further than they did in the South. So they could even send telegraphs telling them what they needed, and just things were able to happen much more quickly, which was a huge deal. This was really the first time that we see trains being used in the war effort, and the North used them really effectively. All right, agriculture and terrain. So the North didn't really have agricultural centers. They even bought their cotton from the South. Most of the fighting, however, was done in the South, and the Northerners were not as familiar with that terrain. However, in the South, cotton was hugely important cash crop. So because they had so much of it, they still were able to sell their cotton all over the world and use that money from these exports to buy things that they needed for the war effort. Also, the majority of the fighting took place in the South. How would these factors have given an advantage to the South? Stop here and pause to write down some answers. Okay, so again, this is an advantage that the Southerners had. They were fighting in the Confederate Army, and they were familiar with the areas in which they were fighting. They knew the land better, so that gave them an advantage. And then they also, because they had so much cotton, they were able to get the supplies that they needed to fight in the war. So as you're thinking, and we're talking here about advantages and disadvantages, I want you to just remember why they're fighting. So in the South, they're really fighting to keep slavery their way of life. They disagreed with the leadership of the country, Abraham Lincoln, and the vision he had for the future of the nation. They wanted to become an independent nation, really to keep the institution of slavery alive. In the North, if you were to ask a Northern soldier why they were fighting really to keep the Union together. Some of them were passionate about freeing slaves, and some were mainly just passionate about keeping the Union together. These are important things to remember because really when you're one-on-one, when you're fighting someone, it matters why they're there. So now we're about to switch into the war. Really gets into full swing next week. This week you will read some letters from some soldiers, and just pay attention to what those things can teach us about the war, about what was going on, about the needs, about what was going well, what wasn't going well. And keep that in mind as you read those. Let me know if you guys have any questions. If you need any help, come to my office hours from 1 to 2 o'clock every day, and I will see you later.